The mower was a Husqvarna, top of the line, $8,000 worth of Swedish engineering that hummed like it had been assembled by angels. Helen Winters sat on the black leather seat, her manicured fingers wrapped around the steering wheel, and felt the weight of stolen property beneath her like a throne. She'd been doing this for 5 years. The first one was easy. Back in 2019, when the Connells moved in at 447 Sycamore, they'd left their new mower in the garage during a 2-week vacation. Helen, as HOA president, had a master key to every garage in the Meadowbrook Estates neighborhood. She'd simply borrowed it. By the time the Connells returned, she'd already told them their garage door had been malfunctioning, that she'd had maintenance check it, and that the security footage had mysteriously corrupted. No proof, no recourse. Just a missing mower and a lesson in not bringing expensive things to neighborhoods where Helen Winters held power. The Berg's cordless leaf blower came next. Then the Ramirez family's ceramic planter collection, hand-painted Portuguese pieces worth $3,000. She justified that one to herself. The pottery was unsightly according to neighborhood aesthetics guidelines. She'd filed an official complaint, given them 2 weeks to remove it, and when they didn't because they'd been in the hospital with their daughter, Helen removed it herself. Donated it, she'd told herself, to a good cause. Her living room was a museum of theft disguised as HOA-sanctioned, community property retrieval. This morning, on the first Saturday of July, Helen had her eye on something bigger. The Matthews house at 512 Sycamore had just received a delivery, a top-tier professional-grade mower, the kind contractors used, the kind that would make Bethany Matthews the undisputed queen of lawn maintenance in Meadowbrook Estates. Helen simply couldn't allow that. Her own lawn was immaculate, but a professional mower would elevate it beyond peer competition. It would send a message. She wasn't just the HOA president, she was better. The Matthews family was at their lake house for the weekend. Helen knew this because she'd made it her business to know everyone's schedules, vacation plans, and movements. Power required information. Information required surveillance masquerading as community involvement. She'd backed the mower out of the Matthews garage at 6 a.m., early enough that neighbors were still sleeping, late enough that it didn't seem suspicious. She'd wheeled it onto her property via the narrow service path between their yards, a path that technically belonged to the HOA, but which Helen had quietly privatized through paperwork errors nobody else had thought to question. Now, at 8 a.m., she was already on her third pass across her own lawn, the powerful engine drowning out the sound of nearby sprinklers and the distant voices of other neighbors doing Saturday chores. The grass fell in perfect rows, each blade severed at precisely the same height. Helen believed in standards, in order, in the kind of control that came from understanding exactly which rules applied to you and which ones applied to everyone else. "Morning, Helen," a voice cut through the mower's roar. Helen killed the engine and turned. It was Marcus Webb from across the street, jogging with his dog. He was newish to the neighborhood, only 3 years, and still harbored the naive belief that HOA was a democratic institution. He'd challenged one of her parking regulations last spring. She'd had his car towed twice before he learned to park exactly where Helen's policies dictated. "Marcus," she waved, her face rearranging itself into the expression she used for neighbors, warm, maternal, slightly disappointed in everyone. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "Gorgeous, is that a new mower?" Marcus called, slowing his jog. His black lab, Duke, sniffed the air, confused by the mechanical smell of gasoline and fresh-cut grass. "Just trying out something new," Helen said smoothly. "Wanted to see if it improves the overall aesthetic of the street. Research, really, for the neighborhood." Marcus nodded. He always nodded. People like Marcus, people with decency, with a belief in the basic goodness of others, were easy to manage. You just had to speak their language, use words like community and research and everyone's benefit, and they accepted anything. "Well, it sounds great," Marcus said, scratching Duke behind the ears. "Really professional." "Thank you," Helen smiled. Beneath that smile was the knowledge that she'd rejected Marcus's request to add a vegetable garden to his front yard because it violated neighborhood aesthetic standards. She'd fined the Sanchez family $50 a month for the last 18 months because their fence was a shade of gray that didn't align with community expectations. She'd enforced a rule, one she'd literally invented, that required all outdoor Christmas decorations to come down by January 2nd. When the Kowalskis left theirs up until January 5th, she'd photographed it, filed a formal complaint, and assessed them another fine. The fines all went to her discretionary fund. She was very good at discretionary spending. I should get back to it, Helen said, reaching for the mower's ignition. Trying to keep the neighborhood standards where they need to be. Of course, Marcus said. He jogged away, Duke bounding ahead with the casual joy of a dog who didn't know about property theft or HOA tyranny or the small brutalities that governed suburban American life. Helen restarted the mower and continued her work. The lawn was already perfect, but she kept going, running the blade lower each time, cutting closer to the soil. She'd always been thorough. By 9:30, she was on the southeast corner of her property, the section that bordered the Thibodeau property line. The Thibodeaus were old money. The house had been in the family for 3 generations, and they didn't live there anymore. It was a rental now, occupied by Marcus and his dog and a rotating cast of tenants who never stayed long enough to challenge Helen's authority. The lawn there had been allowed to grow wild this spring. Helen had sent 3 formal notices about it. The property management company was useless, and the Thibodeaus didn't care. They owned the house outright, paid no mortgage, and apparently didn't care about Helen's vision for neighborhood uniformity. So Helen mowed it anyway. She'd mowed the Thibodeau lawn for 4 years now, technically trespassing, technically vandalizing, but framed always as community maintenance and neighborhood standards. If anyone ever challenged her, she'd produce documentation of the official complaints she'd filed. She'd argue that she was doing the owners a favor. Most people didn't have the nerve to go that far in a confrontation. Most people would rather accept Helen's version of events than spend the emotional energy fighting someone so confident in their own righteousness. The mower hummed forward, eating grass, and Helen settled into the rhythm of it. She loved this part, the total control, the transformation of chaos, long grass, wild growth, into order, precise rows, uniform height. It was what drew her to the HOA in the first place, the ability to remake the world according to her specifications, the right to enforce her vision on people who had no choice but to accept it. The back corner of the Thibodeau property was the wildest section, thick with growth, slightly overgrown with thistle and clover. Helen leaned forward on the mower, determined to reclaim it, to make it comply with her standards just like everything else in this neighborhood. That's when she felt the first resistance. Not the soft thud of the blade hitting an underground stump or root. Not the familiar catch of hitting a rock, though yes, she should have checked for rocks first, should have been more careful. This was something else, something solid, something with structure. The mower lurched violently to the right. Helen's hands gripped the steering wheel as the engine sputtered, choked, and then nearly stalled. The noise changed from a smooth hum to a grinding, teeth-rattling shriek. She immediately cut the ignition, her heart hammering. The mower came to a stop. Silence rushed in, the absence of the engine's roar leaving her ears ringing. Helen sat on the warm seat, breathing hard, looking at the section of lawn she'd just mowed. The grass here looked different, thinner, almost disturbed, like the earth had been turned over recently, then replanted with grass seed that hadn't taken quite as well as the grass around it. She got off the mower carefully, her legs slightly shaky. She walked to the spot where she'd felt the impact and knelt down. The soil here was loose. She dug her fingers into it, expensive manicure be damned, and felt around. Her fingertips brushed something smooth, cold, metallic. Helen's breath caught. She dug deeper, pulling away grass and soil. The metal object was old, heavily rusted. She traced its outline with her fingers. It was curved, ornate. There was an embossed pattern beneath the rust. Letters, maybe, or decorative work. It felt like the corner of something large, something buried deep. Helen sat back on her heels, her mind working through possibilities. A buried utility box. That didn't make sense. Utilities would be marked on the county records. A piece of old farm equipment. The Thibodeaus had owned this land for 80 years, but before that it was farmland, so maybe. She pulled more soil away. The metal object continued beneath the surface, going down and down. It was shaped like, she had to dig more to understand. She worked her way along one edge, her designer clothes getting dirty, her expensive salon nails breaking in the earth. She unearthed what looked like a decorative handle. It was about 3 inches long, curved, with ornamental work on its surface. The kind of handle you'd see on something ceremonial, something important. Something like a coffin. Helen's hands went still. No, that was insane. That was a complete. But even as her rational mind rejected it, her hands kept digging. They had to know. Her brain had fastened onto the image, and now her body was in the service of confirmation. She exposed more soil, working along the object's edge. The metal was definitely shaped like the corner of a large box. The handle she'd found was definitely ceremonial. This was definitely burial hardware. She worked faster now, almost frantically, pulling away soil, exposing what looked like the corner of a metal case. There was a name on it, letters embossed into the metal, now nearly obliterated by rust and time. She traced them with her fingertip. EM-L. And below that, a date. She scraped rust away from the numbers. 1874. Helen sat back on the grass, breathing hard, her hands covered in reddish soil that looked disturbingly like dried blood. A coffin. There was an actual coffin buried in the Thibodeau property. A coffin that had been in the ground for 150 years. A coffin that had just become very much her problem. She stood up, her mind racing through implications. The property records didn't mention a burial site. The Thibodeaus didn't know about it. Surely they would have mentioned it or had it professionally exhumed and relocated decades ago. This was something hidden, something buried and forgotten. Helen looked down at her exposed mower blade, which had only just grazed the coffin's corner. An inch lower and the blade would have struck it more directly. The blade would have damaged it. And then it would have become an active crime scene, because this was probably a grave. This was probably an unmarked cemetery. And in all her years of running Meadowbrook Estates with an iron fist, Helen had never considered that she was literally walking on top of the forgotten dead. She took a breath, thinking practically. The Marcus Webbs and the Sanchez families and all the other people she'd bullied and fined and controlled, they didn't need to know about this. The property management company didn't need to know. The Thibodeaus could find out later, when it was solved and managed and turned into something that couldn't hurt her. What Helen needed was to make this go away, the same way she made all problems go away. She looked down at the corner of the coffin, still partially exposed to the summer air after 150 years of burial. She looked at her stolen mower. She looked at the perfect lawn that had covered up this secret for 15 decades. Then she grabbed a shovel from her garden shed and got to work covering it back up. By noon, Helen had restored the Thibodeau lawn to its overgrown state, carefully replanting the grass sections she'd disturbed and using a garden rake to obscure the marks of her digging. The coffin corner remained exposed beneath the soil, but the surface looked natural again, just another unmanicured section of wild lawn, exactly as unmaintained as the property management company had allowed it to become. She returned the stolen mower to the Matthews garage while the neighborhood slept through lunch hour, using the same service path, the same careful timing. Back by 1 o'clock, sitting in her air-conditioned kitchen with a glass of sparkling water, the soil still under her manicured fingernails despite 3 washings. Helen opened her laptop and searched. Unmarked graves, suburban properties, and old burial sites found, and cemetery 1874 New England. The internet flooded her with results, discovered graves, slave cemeteries found beneath housing developments, mass unmarked burial sites, and most importantly, the legal implications. Once a grave is discovered, it triggers protocols. Official involvement, state archaeologists, county records searches, documentation, possible reinterment ceremonies, police reports if there's any question about the nature of the death. And in Helen's case, in Helen's very specific case, it would trigger a police investigation into who knew about it, who tried to hide it, and who had just been mowing directly over it with stolen equipment. Helen closed the laptop. She poured another sparkling water. She stood in her pristine kitchen in her pristine house and stared at the tile floor that cost more than most people's cars. All of it built on a foundation of small tyrannies and careful crimes. The mower, yes, but also the fees and the evictions and the arbitrarily enforced rules that kept people afraid of her. The discretionary fund that had paid for her granite countertops. The authority she'd accumulated by being willing to be more ruthless than anyone else. If this buried coffin became public knowledge, if it became a legal matter, it would invite scrutiny. Neighbor scrutiny, police scrutiny. The kind of attention that people like Helen, people who maintained control through careful invisibility, couldn't withstand. Someone would ask about that mower. Someone would ask about the Matthews garage. Someone would start pulling threads and all her careful work would unravel. There was only one solution. Find out what she was sitting on and manage it privately. Helen showered to wash away the dirt, changed into clean clothes, and spent the next 3 hours researching the Thibodeau property. She pulled up county records, historical documents, land grant documentation. The property had been in the Thibodeau family since 1924, when Henry Thibodeau had purchased it from a farmer named Martin Ashford. Before that, public records got fuzzy, old deeds, handwritten transfers, property changing hands multiple times through the 1800s. She found a historical society website for the county and called the number. Riverside Historical Society, this is Patricia speaking. An elderly voice, bright and helpful. Hi Patricia, I'm Helen Winters. I'm doing some research on a property in our neighborhood, and I was wondering if your society has any records related to burial sites from the 19th century. Oh, certainly. What property are we talking about? It's on Sycamore Street. The Thibodeau property. It was a working farm before that, back in the 1800s. She heard the sound of Patricia's fingers moving through papers or perhaps a keyboard. Let me see. Sycamore Street. The Ashford farm, you mean? That land changed hands 3 times between 1850 and 1900. Primarily dairy farming, I believe. Let me check our burial records. There was a pause. Helen held her breath. Interesting. We have a record of a burial in that area in 1874. According to the county log, a woman named Emily Carver was buried on the Ashford farm. Very formal documentation, actually. There's a handwritten record from the county clerk describing the burial, the date, even the cause of death. But there's no indication that it was ever an official cemetery. It seems to be a singular burial. What was the cause of death? Helen asked. Let me see. It says here. Well, it doesn't specify, just says complications of childbirth. It was common enough back then for families to bury people on their own property if they didn't have access to a church cemetery or family burial ground. Emily Carver was likely a servant or farm laborer. The Ashford family would have arranged it themselves. A woman buried in 1874 after complications of childbirth. A singular burial, documented but forgotten. Her name was Emily Carver. Is there anything else in the records? Helen asked carefully. About the burial, about where exactly it was located on the property. Let me see. The clerk who made the record notes that the burial occurred in the eastern corner of the south field. It was marked at the time with a stone cross, apparently, but I suppose that could have been removed during the farm's transition to residential use. Is there something specific you're trying to find? Are you planning an archaeological survey? No, Helen said quickly. No, I'm just helping a friend research their property's history, academic interest, really. Well, I'd recommend checking with the county clerk's office if you want more details. And if you do discover anything while doing work on the property, please do let us know. We always appreciate documentation of grave sites. We're trying to create an archive of all the unmarked burials in the county. Too many of them get lost to time and development. Helen thanked her, ended the call, and sat in her kitchen with the knowledge now firmly embedded in her brain. Emily Carver, born unknown, died 1874, buried in the eastern corner of the south field of what was now the Thibodeau property. A woman whose name had been reduced to a sentence in a historical record, whose grave had been lost to the world until Helen's stolen mower almost destroyed it. And now Helen was the only person who knew exactly where Emily was buried. That evening, Helen attended the HOA board meeting. She sat at the head of the table in the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, flanked by 3 board members who had learned long ago not to challenge her decisions. They discussed landscaping regulations, parking ordinances, architectural guidelines for exterior additions. Helen approved a $15 fine against the Oliveros family for a flagpole that was 1 inch too tall. She tabled a request to allow a resident to paint their front door a non-approved color. She discussed increasing the monthly HOA dues by 7% to fund community improvements. Nobody questioned her. Nobody ever did. Afterward, she went home and sat in her living room among her collection of stolen objects. The cordless leaf blower displayed on her shelves like sculpture, the Portuguese pottery arranged aesthetically on her mantelpiece, and wondered what the hell she was going to do. She couldn't tell anyone about Emily. That much was clear. Telling meant investigation, scrutiny, exposure. But she also couldn't simply leave the coffin there, exposed to the elements, awaiting discovery. The longer it remained buried and hidden, the safer she was. The longer it stayed her secret, the longer she could control the narrative around it. Around 11 p.m., unable to sleep, Helen drove past the Thibodeau property. The lawn was dark, overgrown, indifferent to her concerns. From the street, no one would ever know what was buried in that soil. No marker. No sign, just grass and earth, and the bones of a woman who died 150 years ago kept company by Helen's guilt and knowledge. She drove home and tried to sleep, but the number kept running through her mind. 1874. That was when Emily Carver had been buried. That was when someone, a family member, presumably, or perhaps the Ashford family themselves, had committed her to the ground with whatever ceremony seemed appropriate for a servant woman who died bringing a child into the world. 150 years. And then Helen Winters, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, had almost destroyed her resting place with a stolen mower, chasing an obsession with perfect lawns and perfect neighborhood standards. Helen lay in her dark bedroom and wondered if ghosts were something that happened when you weren't paying attention. Whether they were just the accumulated weight of forgotten people, pressing down through the soil, waiting for someone to notice them. At 2 a.m., Helen got out of bed, opened her laptop, and added Emily Carver's name to a document on her computer, hidden in a folder labeled Neighborhood Statistics. It seemed wrong to keep the burial site secret and the person secret too. At least this way, on this one record that only Helen would ever see, Emily Carver existed. Emily Carver had a name. Emily Carver had a grave. That was all Helen could do. It would have to be enough. For 6 weeks, Helen maintained her perfect facade. She mowed her own lawns, multiple mowers now, properly purchased, and enforced the neighborhood standards with her usual ruthlessness. She fined the Sanchez family another $50 for grass clippings on the sidewalk. She ordered the Kowalskis to remove a birdbath that violated ornamental fixture guidelines. She rejected a request from the Webbs to install a rain garden, citing neighborhood aesthetic standards. The stolen mower was returned to its proper place in the Matthews garage after exactly the right amount of time had passed. If Bethany Matthews wondered where it had been or if she'd ever actually used it, she didn't mention it. Most people didn't have the courage to directly confront Helen. But Helen was having trouble sleeping. Every night she found herself thinking about Emily Carver, about the fact that a woman had died, probably in agony, given that medical care in 1874 was primitive at best, and had been committed to the earth without ceremony, without memorial, without memory. And now that grave was Helen's secret, and she was the only thing standing between it and discovery. She began researching Emily Carver obsessively. She found records of the Ashford farm, searched for marriage certificates or birth records that might give her more information about Emily's life. There was nothing. Emily Carver existed in the historical record for exactly one sentence, the county clerk's notation of her death and burial. That was all that remained. By August, Helen had convinced herself that keeping the grave hidden was actually an act of kindness. If she reported it, archaeologists would excavate the coffin, examine the remains, potentially disturb whatever peace Emily had found in 150 years of burial. If she kept it hidden, Emily remained undisturbed, protected. This logic was, of course, the logic of someone committing a crime and justifying it through progressively more elaborate rationalizations. Helen knew this on some level. She also didn't care. What she cared about was control. Keeping Emily Carver buried also meant keeping Helen Winters' secrets buried. It was a clean equation. Then Marcus Webb called an emergency HOA meeting. "We have a problem," Marcus said, standing at the front of the community center where Helen usually stood, wearing the kind of nervous expression that people got when they were about to do something against their better judgment. A real problem. Helen sat in the audience section, an unusual position for her, and felt the first tremor of fear. Behind Marcus, there was a poster board. It was divided into sections, each section containing printouts and documentation. "I've been doing some research," Marcus continued, his voice shaking slightly. "And I've discovered that the HOA has been fining residents selectively, that certain rules are enforced against some families but not others, that there are discrepancies in the discretionary fund accounting, and that the Matthews family's mower went missing last month and was never reported." Helen's face remained absolutely still. Her hands in her lap were not still, they were trembling. "I've also," Marcus said, pointing to one section of the poster board, "been going through property records and historical documentation because I've been thinking about our neighborhood's history, and I found something interesting about the Thibodeau property." Helen's heart stopped. "There's a burial site there," Marcus said. "An unmarked grave from 1874. A woman named Emily Carver. She's documented in the county records, but it doesn't appear that anyone currently involved in the neighborhood was aware of it. And I think we need to notify the proper authorities and have the grave properly documented and preserved." The room erupted, board members standing, questions, accusations. Helen sat completely silent, watching Marcus with the particular intensity of someone watching their own execution unfold in slow motion. "Marcus," she heard herself say, her voice calm and controlled despite the roaring in her ears, "where exactly are you getting this information?" "County historical records," Marcus said. "Public documents. I've been trying to understand how power works in this neighborhood, and when I started pulling threads on the HOA finances, I figured I should also pull some threads on the neighborhood history. I wanted to understand who we are as a community, what our actual values are versus what we claim them to be. And you just decided to make accusations without bringing them to me privately." "Because you're the HOA president," Marcus said. "You're the one I have a problem with." The rest of the meeting was chaos. Other residents who'd been fined arbitrarily started calling out their own experiences. The Sanchez family mentioned their $1,500 fine for aesthetic violations. The Oliveros family brought paperwork showing that a neighbor had done extensive exterior work that went unpunished while they'd been cited for minor infractions. It became clear, very quickly, that Helen's system of selective enforcement had been noticed and resented for years. People had just been too intimidated to say anything until Marcus gave them permission. By the end of the meeting, the board was calling for a financial audit. Someone was calling the County Historical Society about proper procedures for handling unmarked burial sites, and Helen was being asked to recuse herself from the discussion. She stood, her face a mask of outrage and wounded dignity. "I've served this neighborhood with integrity for years," she said, her voice cold and perfect. "And this is the gratitude I receive from someone who clearly doesn't understand how complex community management is. I've made hard decisions for the greater good. Every fine I've issued was warranted. Every rule I've enforced was for the benefit of property values and community standards." "By crushing people who disagree with you," Marcus said quietly. "I don't crush anyone," Helen said. "I maintain order. There's a difference." "There really isn't," Marcus replied. Helen left the meeting and drove home. She sat in her pristine kitchen, looking at her stolen pottery and her stolen mower and her stolen power, and understood with crystal clarity that it was all about to be taken from her. The County Historical Society contacted the Thibodeaus. The Thibodeaus, surprisingly, cared. They hired a professional archaeological team. Within 2 weeks, there was a survey happening on the Thibodeau property, with university students and professional archaeologists marking off grid sections and beginning the process of carefully excavating the grave site. Helen watched from her house, binoculars in hand like a criminal obsessing over a crime scene. The archaeologists worked methodically, carefully removing soil in precise increments, documenting every layer. It took 3 days before they reached the coffin. When they did, they found something Helen hadn't anticipated. Emily Carver wasn't alone. Inside the coffin, nestled beside Emily's skeletal remains, was a small skull. An infant. Emily had been buried with her child, the baby that had killed her during delivery, lost in the same moment as its mother. The archaeologists worked with reverent precision, carefully removing both sets of remains for proper documentation and analysis. There would be burial records. There would be reinterment ceremonies. Emily Carver and her unnamed daughter would be given, a century and a half later, the respect they should have received in 1874. Helen watched the team work, and something inside her, some carefully maintained structure of justification and rationalization, began to crack. The audit revealed everything. The discretionary fund had been used for Helen's personal landscaping, her kitchen renovation, her stolen artwork and furnishings. Tens of thousands of dollars that had been extracted from a neighborhood of people who trusted her to be a steward of their community resources. The financial irregularities alone warranted criminal charges. But it was the stolen mowers that really drove the narrative. When the police began investigating the HOA finances, they also began investigating the missing equipment. The Berg's leaf blower had been traced to Helen's house. The Matthews family's expensive mower had been traced to Helen's garage. The Connolly mower, the first one, the inspiration for 5 years of theft, was in Helen's shed. Helen was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Two police cars pulled into her driveway while her neighbors watched from across their manicured lawns. She was read her rights and placed in the back of a squad car, her arrested transformation happening at a public event in Meadowbrook Estates, where word traveled at the speed of Wi-Fi. By noon, she'd been booked on embezzlement, theft, and fraud. She was released on bail that evening, her lawyer, an exhausted woman who'd already heard the whole sordid story, advising her to maintain silence and prepare for prosecution. Helen sat in her pristine house with the ceramic pottery staring at her from the mantelpiece and understood that this was how it ended. Not with a bang of justice, but with the slow accumulation of every crime she'd committed, every person she'd crushed, finally reaching a critical mass that couldn't be ignored anymore. Her lawyer informed her that her best option was likely to accept a plea deal: restitution, probation, community service, and a permanent ban from HOA service. She would lose her position immediately. There would be a civil lawsuit from the neighborhood association. She would likely lose money. She would likely lose face. She would definitely lose control. That evening, Helen went to the Thibodeau property as the sun was setting. The archaeological team had finished their initial documentation. The site was marked with ropes and careful labels. There was a small bronze plaque that had been erected. Emil Wycarver and child. 1874. Buried with love on this ground. It was a simple marker, respectful and permanent. Helen stood and read it several times, as if the words might change if she studied them hard enough. She would have wanted that, a voice said. Helen turned to find Marcus Webb standing there with Duke, the dog sniffing the marked grave with canine concern for the dead beneath the earth. "I didn't know you'd done this," Helen said quietly. "The Historical Society did most of it," Marcus replied. "The Thibodeaus insisted. They felt bad that she'd been buried on their property and forgotten for so long. They wanted to make it right. The Thibodeaus didn't even know she was there." "Neither did I," Marcus said. "Neither did anyone, because you kept it hidden, because you prioritized your control over people's right to know their own neighborhood's history." Helen wanted to defend herself. The words formed in her mouth. "She's safer hidden. Emily's remains are preserved by the soil. I was protecting her." But she stopped herself because she knew the truth. She had hidden Emily Carver's grave the way she hid everything, to maintain power, to avoid scrutiny, to prevent anyone from having information that might challenge her authority. "I had no idea what I was doing," Helen said finally. "When I found the coffin, I just panicked." "That's clear," Marcus said. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" "Face charges, serve my sentence, pay restitution, lose everything I've built." "Good," Marcus said without malice. "That's what should happen." He walked away, Duke at his side, leaving Helen alone at Emily Carver's grave. She stood there as the sun set, casting long shadows across the marked burial site. She thought about Emily, who'd been a servant or laborer on the Ashford farm, who'd been pregnant and given birth and died in an era when childbirth was nearly as dangerous as war. She thought about Emily's child, the unnamed infant who'd never had a chance at the world. She thought about how both of them had been buried in this field for 150 years, and nobody had remembered them or marked them or honored them until a mower blade almost destroyed their coffin. And she thought about how her own need for control, her own obsession with perfect lawns and perfect order, had led her to nearly destroy the only memorial that Emily and her child had left. Helen went home and called her lawyer. "I want to enter the plea agreement," she said. "And I want to create a fund from my restitution payments for historical preservation for the neighborhood. I want Emily Carver's grave maintained in perpetuity." Her lawyer was silent for a moment. "That's a surprisingly decent impulse." "It's the least I can do," Helen said. Helen Winters's trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented evidence of embezzlement and theft. Helen's own lawyer advised her to accept responsibility and appeal to the judge's sense of proportion. She wasn't a career criminal, just a person who'd let power corrupt her incrementally over 5 years. The judge wasn't particularly sympathetic. "Ms. Winters, you created a system of selective enforcement and financial theft that was designed to extract money and control from your community," the judge said during sentencing. "You justified this through bureaucratic language and regulations that you invented. You stole from your neighbors while claiming to serve them. And when you discovered historical remains on a neighbor's property, your first instinct was to hide it rather than report it." Your actions demonstrate not just a lack of judgment, but a fundamental contempt for the people you were supposed to serve. Helen received 18 months of probation, 300 hours of community service, and was ordered to pay $47,000 in restitution. She was permanently banned from holding any HOA position. She lost her position immediately, effective that day. She also lost her house. The civil lawsuit from the neighborhood association resulted in a judgment that exceeded her liquid assets. To satisfy it, she had to sell the house that had been her seat of power for 15 years. She watched the "sold" sign go up in her yard with a sense of detached numbness. The family who bought it had young children. They wanted to redesign the landscaping. Helen's perfect lawns were already being scheduled for renovation. Marcus Webb became the interim HOA president, pending elections. His first act was to repeal most of Helen's arbitrary rules. The architectural guidelines became reasonable. The fine structure was reformed to prevent selective enforcement. The discretionary fund was open to community vote, with quarterly meetings where residents could propose spending. It was boring, democratic government, the kind of thing that nobody could argue with because it was fundamentally fair. Helen completed her community service hours working on a local cemetery, ironically enough, maintaining the graves of people who, like Emily Carver, had been buried and largely forgotten. She planted flowers. She cleaned headstones. She raked leaves. Physical work, purposeful work, the kind of thing that didn't require her to make judgments about other people's lives. And she stayed away from Meadowbrook Estates entirely. 3 months after her sentencing, when Helen's house had been fully transferred to its new owners, she received a letter from the Thibodeaus. They enclosed a photograph of Emily Carver's grave marker, now surrounded by flowers, well-maintained, the sort of care that suggested someone had been tending it. "Ms. Winters," the letter began, "we wanted you to know that thanks to the preservation fund you've created through your restitution payments, we've established a small annual ceremony to honor Emily Carver and her child. We also wanted you to know that we discovered, through further historical research, that Emily Carver had family, a sister who survived her. We've been able to trace some of their descendants, and 3 of them attended the first ceremony. They felt grateful that Emily was finally being remembered. They asked us to tell you that they appreciate what you've done to honor her grave. They said that Emily would have wanted that." Helen sat in her small rental apartment, all that she could afford after restitution and the sale of her house, and cried for the first time since her arrest. She hadn't been trying to honor Emily, she'd been trying to hide her. But perhaps redemption wasn't about intention. Perhaps it was about what you did after you realized you'd done something wrong. Perhaps it was about accepting punishment and trying, in some inadequate way, to repair the damage you'd caused. She didn't know if that was true, but she decided to believe it anyway. A year and a half later, Helen Winters was no longer the HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates. She was no longer wealthy or powerful or feared. She was simply a woman living in a small apartment, working as a landscape consultant, honest work, helping people design gardens and maintain lawns, though never again for an HOA. She'd read everything she could find about Emily Carver. The Historical Society had eventually traced Emily's life. She was born in Maine in 1851 to a family of Irish immigrants. She'd come to work on the Ashford farm at age 22. She'd become pregnant, to whom the records didn't specify, and had died in childbirth at age 23. 1 year, 2 years of service on a farm, working hard labor, and then childbirth, and then death, and then burial in a field that would become a suburban neighborhood. And then forgotten for 150 years until a woman with a stolen mower and an obsession with control almost destroyed her resting place. The neighborhood had changed since Helen left. The arbitrary rules were gone. The Sanchez family had been able to keep their vegetable garden. The Oliveros family had painted their front door an unapproved color, a beautiful deep blue, and nobody fined them. Marcus Webb had instituted a community garden in the common area. The Kowalskis had installed their Christmas decorations and left them up until they felt like taking them down. The neighborhood was messier now, less uniform, less controlled. It was also happier. Helen knew this because she'd driven past occasionally, careful never to stop, never to intrude. She could see the evidence in the way people sat on their front porches, the way children played in yards that weren't perfectly maintained, the way residents had conversations in small groups without seeming afraid. She destroyed that happiness through her control. And now she was learning to live in a world where she wasn't the authority figure, wasn't the final arbiter of rules, wasn't the person who decided what was acceptable and what wasn't. It was harder than she'd expected. On the one-year anniversary of Emily Carver's reburial ceremony, a formal event attended by members of Emily's extended family, the Historical Society, and residents of Meadowbrook Estates, Helen waited until after dark and drove to the Thibodeau property. The grave marker was illuminated by small solar lights. The flower beds around it had been planted with wildflowers, not the uniform, manicured landscaping that Helen would have chosen, but a beautiful riot of color, purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans and delicate lupins, all growing in cheerful disorder. Helen knelt in front of the marker and placed a small stone on top of it, a tradition she'd learned, the way mourners left markers at graves to show they'd visited. "I'm sorry," she said quietly to the ground, to the bones beneath it, to the ghost of a woman who died a century and a half ago. "I'm sorry that you died. I'm sorry that you were forgotten. I'm sorry that it took me nearly destroying you to care about remembering you." She didn't know if ghosts listened or if the dead cared about apologies. She didn't know if redemption was even possible after the things she'd done. But she believed that some things were worth doing anyway, and leaving flowers on graves and saying sorry to the dead seemed like one of them. As Helen turned to leave, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the property. It was Marcus Webb, walking Duke through the neighborhood as usual. They didn't speak. Marcus didn't appear to have seen her, or if he had, he pretended not to. But as Helen drove away, she saw him approach Emily's grave and place his own stone on the marker. Then he continued his walk into the darkness, the dog leading him forward into whatever came next. Helen drove home to her small apartment. She opened her laptop and made a small donation to the Historical Society's Unmarked Grave Preservation Fund. She updated her will to ensure that her remaining assets would go to Emily's perpetual care fund. She did the small, quiet things that people do when they're trying to repair harm that can never be fully repaired. And then she went to bed, and for the first time in 18 months, she slept without the weight of secrets pressing down on her. Emily Carver and her unnamed daughter rested in the ground beneath Meadowbrook Estates, finally at peace, finally remembered, finally safe from the people who wanted to erase her, control her, or remake her in their own image. Helen Winters, stripped of her power and authority and carefully constructed identity, had become something else. A woman learning to live in a world she didn't control, learning that losing everything might be the only way to gain grace. The lawn grew over the grave marker, beautiful and wild and utterly beyond anyone's ability to perfectly maintain it. And beneath that grass, beneath the soil that had hidden secrets for a century and a half, the dead rested with dignity. The mower never came again. 5 years later, Meadowbrook Estates had evolved into something completely different from what Helen Winters had created. The HOA still existed, necessary, functional, actually democratic now, but it was no longer a tool for social control. The neighborhood had become known as one of the more diverse and welcoming suburban communities in the state. Young families moved there. People of different backgrounds lived side by side. Some lawns were perfectly maintained, and some were overgrown with vegetable gardens, and some were a beautiful mix of both. Emily Carver's grave had become a minor historical landmark, featured in Regional Historical Society tour. Her family held an annual memorial service. The Thibodeaus, who still owned the property though they didn't live on it, had established a scholarship fund in Emily's name for descendants of Irish immigrants. It was small, and it would never be enough to balance the scales, but it was something. Helen Winters lived quietly in a city 30 miles away from Meadowbrook Estates. She worked as a landscape designer, but specializing in something different now. Designing gardens for nursing homes and community centers, spaces where people could gather and feel less alone. She was good at it, though she never told clients about her past. She attended Emily Carver's annual memorial service, standing at the back, not speaking to anyone, just paying respects to the woman whose death had, in an indirect way, caused Helen's redemption. She left flowers. She left a stone. She left the weight of her apologies in the soil. And then she went home to her small apartment, paid her bills, did her taxes, lived a quiet life that had none of the power or control she'd once craved. Sometimes, late at night, she wondered if Emily Carver would have forgiven her. She didn't know. She didn't think she deserved forgiveness. But she did know that she deserved to spend the rest of her life trying to earn it. The mower that had nearly destroyed everything sat in a museum now, donated by the Historical Society, displayed as part of an exhibit on the hidden graves of New England. There was a plaque explaining what had happened, how a careless moment with yard maintenance had unearthed history that had been buried and forgotten. Nobody mentioned Helen's name in connection with the discovery. That was fine. She didn't want to be remembered. She wanted Emily Carver to be remembered. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed around Emily's grave marker, Helen sent money to the Thibodeaus to ensure they kept growing. Wild, beautiful, utterly beyond anyone's ability to perfectly control them.